Hi, this is Claudia Filos with the Center for Hellenic Studies, and I'm so delighted to be joined here today by our special guest, Keith Stone. Keith, thanks for joining us.
Sure, I'm excited. Thanks for inviting me.
And we're also joined here by many members of our community who I hope will introduce themselves when they have a chance to ask a question or to share a comment. But right now what I'd like to do is just share a very brief bio about you, Keith, with our wider audience. I want to let everyone know that you're a postdoctoral fellow in comparative study of ancient texts, instructional design, and research publications with the Center for Hellenic Studies. You have earned your PhD in 2013 through the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. Your dissertation has been published as Singing Moses' Song, a performance critical analysis of Deuteronomy's Song of Moses. And your research really focuses on the dynamics of performing in traditional settings, particularly within traditions linked to founders. And also I want to let people know you're additionally interested in Northwest Semitic languages and inscriptions, land ideology, the psychology of abuse and trauma in biblical texts, and of course the ancient Greek mythology and the hero of cult in ancient Greece. So thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, it's my pleasure. Let's see, how should I start?
Yeah, well, so today we're really going to be focusing on this section of the Hebrew Bible, right, which is known as the Song of Moses. Can you just introduce us to this for a few minutes?
Great. So the Song of Moses, well, I do this in my book, and I'll just kind of repeat a bit verbally or orally here. I was taking a seminar with Greg Naj on oral poetics, and I was thinking, what can I write my paper on for this seminar? What is the most obviously performed text in the Bible? And the Psalms come to mind, and they even have little instructions for performance. You know, sing to the tune of whatever, or well, several different tunes. I'll put it that way.
Okay.
But those are kind of overdone. So I just started leafing through the Old Testament from the beginning, from Genesis, and I came across several embedded ancient poems in the prose. But I rediscovered that the Song of Moses in chapter 32 of Deuteronomy has a very elaborate introduction in chapter 31 about how it should be performed and why. It's given a kind of history, an origin story. And that was very interesting to me. And so I wrote about that for my paper, and that ended up becoming my dissertation.
Great. So can you just tell us a little bit, I mean, if you were going to summarize the content of the song and also its context, can you share that with us?
Yeah, definitely. So how should we say this? Deuteronomy treats the Song of Moses as an existing text, kind of like the Ten Commandments. It incorporates it as a famous thing that people know. And it gives it this mission that it will, how should I say, it will be a witness against the Israelites in the future. And a lot of the poem is about recounting first God's generosity to the Israelites and provision for them, and then they're turning away to other gods, and God's anger, a lot of focus on anger and vengeance.
Okay. And because at this point in the narrative, I think what's going on is that Moses has already been informed that he will not make it sort of to the promised land, right? Someone else will have to take over. And then Yahweh, how should we say Yahweh?
I'm going to say God.
God, okay. Okay, so God has told Moses that the Israelites are going to then go on to do terrible things. They're going to sort of abandon him, right? Abandon their...
Yeah, the larger context. The Israelites have been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. They're on the edge of the promised land. They pause, and Moses says, okay, let me retell you the law that you heard at Sinai, or that we heard. And then that's the book of Deuteronomy. Some narrative, but mostly recitation of laws.
Right.
It's different. Like Deuteronomy changes things while it pretends to continue them. But that's any traditional kind of society does that kind of thing.
Right. So it's in the context of this sort of re-delivery, re-performance of laws that suddenly Moses is told to write down the song, right?
Yeah, equivalent to the Ten Commandments. That too is written down, and both are deposited in the Ark of the Covenant. So they're two kind of equally weighty texts that kind of bookend
Right.
the major portion of Deuteronomy.
Which is amazing because on the one hand, maybe many of us in the Judeo-Christian know so much about the Ten Commandments, but we may not know so much about the Song of Moses.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But it turns out that the Song of Moses is really influential in much of later prophecy. Most of the themes are there in the Song of Moses. And there has been a big debate over whether the song comes first and inspires the prophets, or the song came later and kind of summarized the prophets. So
Okay.
that's, but let's see. So Deuteronomy, the large context. I think we've got done the narrow context.
Yeah.
So yeah, the content is this. It's a prophetic lawsuit. There's a certain kind of genre where God has an argument with his people, and the prophet announces this and goes through all of the grievances, and that's what the song is. Yeah.
Great. So shall we kind of open it up to discussion and get some reactions from our community members about what they read, or would you like to read a few passages first? Or
since I gave you some homework, I wonder what any of you thought of the text. I would like just to start this way, to get your impressions. Did anything stand out to you that you find remarkable in some way? Do you have any urgent questions about the meaning of something? Just what comes to mind, if you've done the homework. I know not everyone has time.
Okay, well, we do have one hand up, so Bill, please, can you introduce yourself?
This is Bill Moulton from Petersburg, Alaska. On the Panhandle, we don't have any snow at the moment.
Yes.
So you know what surprised me about the reading is, I don't know, I'm sure I saw it in church 1,000 times. I probably read it before, but I did not realize the law was read out loud in public every 7 years. And I just don't remember a whole lot of scripture about that. I think it'd be a bigger thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was, or it was supposed to be. Deuteronomy has a kind of utopian vision for Israelite society, and so there's a question whether it was ever realized. And there's not a lot of evidence that the Song of Moses was so important, even if it was a well-known song in the past. I mean, it's part of Jewish liturgy today, even, but it's not some all-important text.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else?
Any other reactions or questions from our community members about just sort of their reading in general?
Deuteronomy stuff or Psalm 24?
Okay, well, it sounds like people are being a little bit shy. Keith, I did have a question. One thing that jumped out at me, so maybe I'll just ask that now. I was struck by all the changes in person, right? Mm-hmm. In the text. And so there are many times where so they are going to this, and you are doing this, and I say this. So maybe you'll get to this at some point in your presentation, but at some point, can we think about that change and what it means for the speaker of the song to be changing, I guess, person, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I do plan to get to that.
Oh, good.
So
great. So then,
do a bit of what I have, I suppose.
Great. So, then how should we be thinking about performance then in terms of this text?
Mm-hmm. There are two ways I think that we should think about performance, and I drew them both from experience with Greg, the way he treats certain texts, the way he treats Homeric poetry, and the way that he treats a text like Sappho 1. Mm-hmm. And let's see. So the Homeric poetry angle is that it's about a tradition of performance, and so the idea is when you perform, you reenact the kind of founding performer that came before and inspired the whole tradition. So if you're a Homeric rhapsode, when you perform, you are becoming Homer while you do that. We don't have that kind of thing so much right now. We don't have professional guilds of Homer singers or any other kind of singer like that. But you can see something similar in the idea of covering a famous song by somebody else. So, and if they're well known enough, you can't avoid interacting with that persona. So if you're performing the song "Love Me Tender," which is a famous Elvis song, there's no way that you're not being compared to Elvis, or people aren't thinking about Elvis. Like, the song means Elvis, and his persona is very much present. Despite, you're seeing words about something and all, excuse me, and all that, whatever the content is, but Elvis is there somehow in the room. The Elvis example reminds me that we do have the genre of Elvis impersonators.
Okay.
Actually, maybe that is a professional guild.
Right. Okay. So that's interesting. So here we're talking about people who take on the persona, but I think that's understood, as you say, as impersonation, right? So you're playing a character as opposed to sort of becoming. I mean, what you were describing with the Homeric tradition is that you are really becoming that speaker, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, no, and I think that's the same. It happens the same way with quote unquote regular performance. I mean, Greg has, his argument is based on the conceit of the poetry as inspired by the muses, and that the poet has a direct mental connection. If we think of the word memnemai in hour 2 of the ancient Greek hero in 24 hours. And that's the way that the Homeric poet or Homeric singer becomes Homer, through that divine connection.
And memnemai, Greg is translating as basically, I have total recall, right? Total and complete recall. So, I mean, is the conceit within this song tradition, within this poetry tradition, the same?
Well, I would say that that's the way that Homeric poetry explains it, but it operates in any performance tradition. So there's something analogous, perhaps, if we look for something to compare. In the case of the Song of Moses, the song certainly has an author and a famous first singer, which would be Moses. But also, the song, in a way, has its own persona. It's given actions to perform. God, in giving his mission for the song, says that the song will be a witness against my people, Israel, and that it will answer them. So the song kind of has a life of its own, and that's what I interpret as the analogous part in this tradition.
Yeah, that's so interesting too. Now, where you're saying that the song itself will become the witness, right? Because then the song is its own persona. Well, maybe we could take a look at some of the text, because some people may not be familiar. What do you think?
Yeah, in a second. But there's another aspect of performance, which is something that you mentioned briefly, or that's wording that I would use, is that not only are you performing the people who came before you in real history who performed something, the same thing that you're performing, but you're also performing the characters within the poem or the composition, whatever it is. So, I mean, we have the idea of an actor getting into character, which can also involve the way you dress, the accessories, a period piece, for example, to take it in that direction. Or with storytelling, my first example for this was Goldilocks and the Three Bears. A good storyteller might have a different speaking voice for Papa Bear and Mama Bear and Baby Bear and Goldilocks. So this idea of becoming a character in some sense is, I think, something we can more understand, or more easily understand. So those two aspects of performance are what I draw from Greg's examples. Oh yeah, so Sappho 1, I can bring that up right now. Sappho 1 is where I get this idea of, or where I first took this idea of impersonating a character or becoming a character. So in Sappho 1, Sappho is pleading or appealing to Aphrodite for intervention. And in the poem, Aphrodite appears and speaks as Sappho, or through Sappho's voice. Or Sappho is impersonating Aphrodite. I mean, it depends on how you look at it, which verb you will use. What's interesting there is that the change is not detectable by a shift in grammatical persona. a grammatical person. Like it's all first person. The I of Sappho making her complaint, and then it's the I of Aphrodite answering her. The only thing that signals is the content of the speeches indicate a shift. Suddenly, Sappho was addressing herself by name and speaking, answering the previous content that Sappho had. So that it's different from my example in the Song of Moses. But anyway, those are the two kinds of basic approaches that I take. So as far as the text goes, let's look at Deuteronomy 32, verse 7, rather.
Okay, so Sarah's going to screen share for us, so it's going to take just a second to come out. In the meantime, I want to let everyone know that you can access links to the content here that we'll be looking at through the Cosmos Society website, formerly known as Hour 25. And you can link to all the readings that Keith had suggested that we review in preparation for this talk. So I think everyone should be able to see that now.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Sarah. So in my analysis, a different speech begins at verse 8 and goes beyond the bottom of the page. It's the elders of Israel start talking there. And we know that from the previous verse, where the main voice of the song is speaking, and it gives a command. And in my analysis, the speaking voice of the song addresses the Israelites with you, with second person plural or singular. And this is that voice addressing the Israelites, telling them to remember, to consider the past, and to interrogate their ancestors. And then suddenly a voice starts speaking about things in the third person. And my analysis is that this is the beginning of those, the answer of the elders, of the fathers. This is a kind of subtle example because this change in speaker isn't announced explicitly. It doesn't say, and then the elders said, or, and then your ancestors will say this. They just start speaking. But that's the kind of thing that I look for in this poem.
Right, for these subtle places. And of course, I mean, within a performance tradition, this might be more obvious in terms of performance, right? And maybe one person speaks one part, or one or another group of people speak another part.
Yeah, and that's one interpretation of the Song of Moses, which I disagree with.
Okay, great. Yeah, tell me why.
Someone has lays out their idea of the performance of the song by saying this group says this and this group says this, and there's a priest saying this, and it's very antiphonal. And it can be performed that way, and perhaps it was, but I approach it as sung all by one person because Deuteronomy treats it that way. It has one author, it has one first performer, and well, Deuteronomy in general speaks of an ideal Israelite. And I don't mean ideal as an optimal, just like the Platonic ideal of an Israelite. Should do this, should not do this. It's a kind of individual approach.
Well, I mean, what's so fascinating then is as we think about, I'm going to use the word metonymic, because that's something that Greg has kind of highlighted for us in our community, and we've had many conversations about it, so it's coming to mind, these sort of metonymic connections, right, between individuals and groups and performers in the here and now, the performance and the previous performers, and the, I guess, first performer, who I guess would be Moses, or it could be God, right? Or the originator. I'm not sure how originator, maybe / performer.
Right. Yeah, I had to be careful about that. The text is very vague in chapter 31. It doesn't even say God gave the song to Moses. God just starts speaking about it. He says, this song, write down this song, or put this song in the mouth of the Israelites. In the text, in the translation that I gave you, it says lips, but it's the word mouth. Lips is a lot better in English. So yeah, how did God give this song? Did he write it like he wrote the Ten Commandments? Did he deliver it orally like he gave the commandments the second time after the tablets had been broken? He makes Moses write them. You could look at it that way. Does he sing it? I think that part of the ambiguity is that the song was already existing as tradition, so it doesn't need an origin in a way.
Got it.
What I like to say is that Deuteronomy takes this famous text and appropriates its prestige for itself, for its new message.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, that's why I think that it's vague about the origin of the song.
Oh, that's beautiful. Okay, but let's pause. Let's see. Does anyone have any comments or questions about this? Is this a good time, Keith, to take some questions?
Or actually, let me go to a more obvious example, just because.
Okay, great. Yes, please.
This is the one I'm thinking about now. I might be doing some research on that particular verse, but Sarah, if you could scroll to, let's see, verse 19.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you.
Shall we read this, or will you read this for us, maybe?
Sure. I mean, yeah, I'll just read these two verses. So the Lord saw this and spurned them because of the provocation of his sons and daughters. Then he said, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end shall be, for they are a perverse generation, sons in whom there is no faithfulness. They have made me jealous with what is not God. They have provoked me to anger with their idols. So, and then it reciprocates, I will make them jealous with those who are not a people. And I can't quite see the next line, but it's the same idea. It's reversed. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. This change in speakers here is very obvious because the prophetic voice of the song says, and then God speaks. So that's an obvious one that doesn't require this subtle attention to pronouns or imperatives, that kind of thing. And there's one more that I want to highlight, just to show how far this kind of goes. All these layers of personas. Verse 26, if you could scroll down a bit more, Sarah. So in my analysis, I'm paying attention to all of the previous performers of the song. God as author, Moses as first performer, any intervening Israelites who come between the present Israelite performers and Moses. So Joshua is there. He's also kind of first performer. King David, the prophet Samuel. Depends on where you are in the future history of the song. So all of these kind of personas are there, kind of looking at you, at your performance, wondering if you're going to be the Israelite or the generation of Israelites who will be unfaithful to God. And those are always in the background. And the idea of being a prophet, because this is a prophetic genre, that's also always in the background. But then you have all the personas on the surface, like God is an obvious persona in this song, or the elders, I say, is an obvious persona, or the enemies. So we have this whole stack of personas kind of behind the performance that you're giving. And in verse 26, it's another layer. So God is talking here, and he says, I would have said, I will cut them to pieces, and etc. So he's quoting himself again, or there's another layer of God, because he's already talking. And then he says what he might have said or would have said. And then he gives a reason why he didn't say it. And then later in verse 27,
that's pretty fascinating, actually, right? I mean,
the enemies would have said this. And in fact, when I say the enemies speak in the song, it's really only hypothetical. They don't actually get a voice. God puts words in their mouth. And this is it. So there's all this concern with speech acts.
Yeah.
And that's elsewhere in Deuteronomy too.
I mean, it really seems like a tour de force of management and control over all these different voices and personas, or is this something that is so a part of the tradition, and you see this kind of deep layering of personas throughout the whole text?
You don't really see it much else anywhere else really in the Bible. You see it in Deuteronomy a lot. Wow. And that's the argument that the composers of Deuteronomy themselves were performers of the Song of Moses, and took their own advice to heart. They were influenced by it, and so they also have this kind of obsession with future speech or speech that should be avoided, opinions that should be avoided, basically, and all of that. So yeah, it's unique to Deuteronomy, I think.
Wow, how beautiful. Okay, so maybe we can take some questions, because I think Anne has a question along these lines. And I'm seeing some other questions too. People are posting some questions for us. So Anne, please.
Hello, I'm Anne. I'm from Northeast England. I'm going back a bit, but it's still about this issue of voice. And when you were talking about performance as being the reenactment of the founding performer, I'm wondering if that has some kind of a connection with priests and the way priests claimed to have a direct line to their God. And is this one of the mechanisms by which they express that? By saying, I've been inspired by the muse or by the God, and I have this direct line, and therefore I am a priest. Is there something political going on there?
No, I don't think so. I think that there's always something political going on, but I don't think that it's particularly near the surface in this case. And it's more the institution of prophets than of priests. So there's some overlap. Some priests do give prophetic messages or do get prophetic commissions from God. But the priests are the prophets are kind of a separate movement, you might say, and they often critique priests and the behavior of priests. Yeah, I mean, all prophets do claim this direct link in a way, where they receive a vision or they receive a verbal message from God.
You said there was a mental connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, it's often invisible to other people. They can't see when you claim to have a dream from God. No one else can verify that. No one else was there, or no one else can see the vision that you saw. So there has to be some other way of legitimation. And often that is, the prophet will say, I'm giving you a sign for the future, or a message for the future that will come true. And as verification, here's something that will come true in the immediate present, or the immediate rather, that will verify the truth of my claim.
Okay, thank you.
You know, it's interesting how often that happens in Greek mythology too. The priest is just a priest that does sacrifices. The seers are the ones that come up with the prophecies and explain things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're different functions. Yeah, that's what I can say. We think of them as a kind of merged, I think, for some reason. I'm not quite sure why, actually. That could be an interesting investigation, but yeah, priests, you could think of them as technicians of the divine, I suppose. Yeah. Where prophets, at least in biblical traditions, are more like messengers. They're often called messengers.
I like that, technicians of the divine, Keith. You know, as you were speaking before, I was thinking about the way you were discussing how all these other personas, all these previous performers are present. And that to me sort of made me think about the way that we've been talking about heroes and hero cult and performance within the ancient Greek tradition. I mean, I know it's not exactly the same thing, but do you see resonances of this sense of that when you undertake a performance, you know, heroes are then present, right? I mean, it's not the same thing. I'm not making a very. I mean, I think within the ancient Greek tradition, it's like a physical epiphany. It's different, but
yeah, it is different. There's a physical epiphany of the hero, perhaps. The performance of songs about the hero is meant to bring you closer emotionally to the hero, to have sympathy for the hero and for their ordeal. And yeah, there's a mental connection between the hero and the worshiper if they're worshiping correctly.
That's nice. Yes, the mental connection.
It's different. It is different in this case, in the biblical case of the Song of Moses. ancestor worship is very suppressed in ancient Israel, or it was eradicated, you could say. There are hints of it here and there. I mean, there are explicit prohibitions also, which tells us that it was happening. But there's not a sense of getting in touch with the dead in the same way. That would be to the prophetic message of a different kind, like an oracle or a prediction. Like when Saul goes to get in touch with Samuel, his predecessor, or his mentor, say. Samuel comes up from the ground and he is a ghost, and he very spookily like threatens Saul. That's a different kind of thing. Saul is not performing a song about Samuel or anything like that.
Got it. Well, that's a helpful clarification. I think we have some community questions about meter. Janet, I think you have a question.
Hi, Kit. This is Janet from New York. I was wondering if there is meter in this song, and if you found a formulaic language, and also God's anger and vengeance. That reminded me Apollo very much. So if there's any connection, I don't know.
Okay. Well, I'll talk about the meter and the formulaic language first. There isn't really meter in biblical poetry in general. Poems that are said to be earlier tend to have a slightly more rhythmic feel to them, but it's not regular. There's certainly no rhyme. So it's, many people have tried to figure out the system of biblical poetry's meter and have failed. So far we have determined that there's none. Maybe some genius in the future will figure out how it really works. As far as formulaic language goes, there is, and that's not the way that I've studied the poem, so I don't have any specific examples ready. But in general, biblical poetry has pairs of words with which it ends a line or two lines in a row, because there's a kind of a contrast. One kind of famous interpreter of biblical poetry says the basic idea of a biblical couplet is I make statement A, and then what's more, statement B is also true. So it's a slightly more intensified or elaborated way of saying the same thing, or it can be contrasting. So there's like a 1-2 punch, I guess, in biblical poetry. In ancient Semitic poetry in general, Ugaritic poetry has that as well. And so when you're looking to make that kind of 1-2 movement, you find that pairs of words that go together are very useful to have in mind. One being slightly more specific than the other, or that kind of thing. And so those word pairs at the end of lines often recur in different poems. So that's the kind of formula that I would say biblical poetry works with. Unlike the kind of formulas that Homeric poetry works with, which is very different, has to do with meter, and that kind of thing. Oh, as far as the anger goes?
Right, because can we just talk about that a bit? So, I mean, what the poem describes is a God who says, I'm going to send plagues, I'm going to send my arrows, the children are going to waste away, they're going to be cut down in the streets, right? Yeah, so that's, I mean, kind of like what Apollo does. He sends sickness, and that, I mean, that's an interpretation of what the Song of Moses says too, that it has to do with plague and sickness. Boy, what is Apollo angry at? He's angry at the mistreatment of his priest. And that's not really the case here. It's a different kind of anger, but it's taken very personally. In a way, it's more intense in the case of God in the Song of Moses because it's seen as a personal betrayal. Like the whole people belong with God, and they've gone off to worship other gods. So it's maybe even a more personal affront, so to speak. And then God reciprocates in kind, which is kind of interesting how God allows, you could say it cynically, God allows himself, as he's portrayed in these texts, to be controlled by the behavior of the Israelites. Whatever they do,
whatever mistreatment they give to him, he returns to them in kind. So they're kind of setting the agenda in a way.
Mm.
I've been thinking about more.
Yeah, those kind of, yeah, I see we have two hands. I see Maria and I see Jack.
Okay. Well, my perspective is more of a look at the big picture, and I read it as more of a warning than as a lawsuit or a condemnation. I mean, this and their words that Moses says after the song about this is not just an idle song. This is your lifeline. And to me, it reminded me of two passages in Deuteronomy. The Shema of chapter 6, love God and put this on your doorpost, and teach your children whenever you're with them, that you will thrive and survive. And then the other is you have two choices in life. There are two ways. One leads to death and one to life, and choose life. And I read the song as a celebration of God and choosing life, because if you love God and keep His commandments, as you reach to Him, He reaches to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly the message of Deuteronomy. I would say about the choosing life in Deuteronomy 30, that it's a bit more ominous, because the previous chapter is a giant recitation of all of the misfortune, very graphic misfortune that will befall the Israelites if they don't obey, if they don't love God and obey, which is what that kind of means in Deuteronomy. So it's kind of a threat, choose life or you're choosing death. There's definitely a dark undertone, which is not always so submerged. Sometimes it's just very obvious in Deuteronomy. And, in the Song of Moses too, what changes his mind at the end is not his love for the Israelites. At least it's not said that way. It's apparently his desire not to be thought poorly of by enemy people. That God wants to have credit for himself, that he's in control of the fate of the Israelites. And these enemies start boasting that they have control over the fate of the Israelites. And it's that kind of quarrel over prestige or power that motivates God's mercy to the Israelites in the end.
Right, because what God is saying towards the end of the poem, and I'm talking about your translations here, that I've seen your beautiful book, Keith, and I hope other people take a look at it. And you can get it through Harvard University Press. It's published by ILEX. And so what you, oh, please.
Oh, it's cheap. It's $20.
Oh, yay. Okay. And so, so what I wanted to, just to share in case people don't know. So what happened towards the end of the poem is we've been talking about sort of this, these messages of these terrible things are going to happen. And then the tweak that you're talking about, I think, are these passages where God says, but then the enemies would basically say, look, our gods are better than your gods. So that's the thing you're talking about. And he's like, well, that can't happen. So then in the end, I will come back to you, right?
I will save my people. I will show the enemies who's really boss.
Yeah. All right. So Maria, I know you had a question.
Okay, if I can go back though.
Please, yeah.
Another aspect of Jack's question or comment about the song being a warning, and that's true. I say that it's a warning up to the point where the events become real. So before the Israelites turn away from God and before God punishes them, it is a warning. The generations are progressing and everything is okay. History hasn't gone wrong yet. And the song it's a warning of what could happen. Or God is very specific about it. It's a warning of what will happen. So I agree with what you said on that point. But in history, Deuteronomy was written at a point when it had already come true that the Israelites were worshiping other gods. Maybe they always worshiped other gods. That's another question. And they suffered a disaster. You know, northern Israel was invaded by Assyria. People were deported. So Deuteronomy is offering the song not so much as a warning for the future, because in Deuteronomy's understanding, the present of, you know, there being the destruction of northern Israel, that's the future from the point of view of Deuteronomy. And so it's using the song to explain why it happened, why this disaster happened. It's very convoluted, you know, in the present, projecting back a message for the future, which is the present.
It sounds like, yeah, okay. All right, so I think we're going to Maria now. Maria.
Okay, Keith, thank you very much for this presentation. I'm going to reverse the order. I have one reference to the Oresteia and one question about the nature of Deuteronomy and something that you mentioned. Now, while I was reading the Deuteronomy, I usually read it from the Septuaginta translation. I have the impression that in a way it works something like a vademecum, like a companion of practicing religion.
Mm-hmm.
This is my impression as a reader, okay? But yeah. You mentioned
talking
also,
about the book as a whole. Is that right? The book as a whole?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, the book as a whole. This is my impression as a reader. Okay, please correct me if I'm wrong. Now, the thing is that you talked about something like about, you connected Deuteronomy about the utopia and a utopian society. Is it possible to elaborate on that and to give us some insight about this wonderful idea that you mentioned? And the addition is, it's really wonderful that you mentioned this contrast between or God, how he is presented in Deuteronomy, and Apollo, because we have also this reference in the Oresteia, especially in the Koi Phoroi, where in a way Apollo is presented as compelling Orestes to commit matricide, because otherwise he will send diseases, ulcers, and all kinds of natural hazards if Orestes doesn't commit matricide. So please, you can just start, with my first question.
Okay. That's a nice parallel, by the way, between the Oresteia and the song. I hadn't thought of it once. I'm not sure what to make of it quite. But it's true. It's there. As for the utopian aspect of Deuteronomy, so in its present tense, it's trying to institute a reform of law. That's one thing that it's doing. It's changing some of the laws that came before. So one big example is that earlier versions of the law have provision for sacrificing at different points throughout the land. At your local shrine, you can slaughter an animal and eat the meat if it's prepared correctly. Or slaughtered correctly. In Deuteronomy, there's only one central sanctuary where sacrifice can happen. Religious sacrifice can happen. Mm-hmm. But it makes provision for, when I say butchery, to happen elsewhere, but it's not a sacred slaughter of animals. So that's a big change that it's making. Mm-hmm. And so part of its utopian aspect, I think, is just to make, utopian wouldn't be quite right for that, but it's trying to present a vision for the future that continues as part of its reform. it's it's a vision that was never realized in a way. I mean, the centralization happens, that idea happens, but this, how can we say? Maybe that's not the right way to approach it. It takes the point of view of addressing the future, and gives commands, but it doesn't really show them happening. It's just an idealized version of Israelite society, is really what I can say. It's a law book, and it promises prosperity and longevity if its commands are obeyed.
Yes.
So that's kind of utopian.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Sure. Oh, Claudia, you're muted.
Sorry, I know we have just about 10 minutes left, so I know you had some other things you'd like to cover. I mean, did you want to help us think some more about performance and those personas, or would you like to look at a different part of this text or another text?
Yeah, let me see. So I have a couple of texts here. So I gave you Psalm 24 because it's a kind of classic example of this approach, which is very old, of looking for personas based on shifts in pronoun or imperatives. So it's not new, but it's newly applied to this song, to this poem. And you can kind of see it. Sarah, if you could project Psalm 24. It's more towards the end. So, verse 7. So the interpretation here is that there's a sacred procession seeking to enter the city of Jerusalem, and there's a dialogue between the people who are processing towards the city and the people who are on the walls of the city, deciding whether to let them in. And so the people who are approaching say, "Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in." So this would be a procession of the ark, perhaps, entering Jerusalem. And the people on the wall would answer, "Who is the King of glory?" And then the people approaching would say, "Well, it's the Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. So lift up your heads, O gates, and lift them up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in." And then it's repeated again. Who is this King of glory? He's the Lord of hosts. He is the King of glory. So that's the first example of that kind of approach. It's kind of historical.
So there's this precedent for reading the text in this way. Yeah, that's important for us to understand. So I guess I'm just wondering about your final kind of consensus or your final thoughts about the different personas in the Song of Moses, or about your process of finding them. You know, can you share a few more thoughts about that?
Excuse me. Let's see. Well, there are several voices. There's the prophetic persona of the song. At the beginning, the heavens and the earth speak, because the persona is addressing them and then gives them a command. And so I say that what comes next is the heavens and the earth answering that command. So we talked about the elders, we talked about God, and the hypothetical things that God might say, the hypothetical things that the enemies might say. And that's really it. Then there's just an continuing interplay between these voices throughout the song. And it's all for the purpose of obedience. The earlier versions of the law just kind of gave a list of requirements to be met. Whereas Deuteronomy, coming after the disaster and explaining the disaster by the fact of disobedience, it says, we must have done something wrong if this happened. It says, not only here's the list of things you should do, but here's the way to ensure that you do it. Fear God so that you keep his commandments. Remember what he did for us so that you keep his commandments. Don't forget what he did for us so that we can keep his commandments. What else? Love God so that, same result.
Mm-hmm.
So Deuteronomy is interested in this kind of emotional shaping of Israelites with obedience as the end goal. And my argument is that the Song of Moses fits perfectly into that because it is the dynamics of performance ensure that the Israelites who perform it will take on other emotional perspectives, primarily God's. And that's what God wants. God wants the Israelites to sympathize with him and to avoid his anger. So they avoid it by kind of internalizing it against themselves, which is kind of convoluted.
Wow.
Whether that's psychologically wise is another issue.
Right. So Keith, I mean, this kind of brings up for me one of the things we mentioned as another area of interest for you, which is sort of the psychology of abuse and trauma in biblical texts. I mean, is that, can you talk a little bit about that, what you found in that and why that has been important for your research?
Yeah. A friend of mine gave me a book on angry men in relationships, and I read it, and then I went back to my work on Deuteronomy, and I thought, wow, there are a lot of similarities here. And I kind of was tracking them down, and a lot of what God says to the Israelites is just classic abusive behavior. Things like, you don't deserve my love. That's like the most obvious one, which God says to the Israelites. You're not like a big nation or an obedient nation. You're just like a small, disobedient nation. Why? I love you because I love you, not because you deserve it. So you better be grateful. Or if you ever think about going with somebody else, in terms in Deuteronomy, but
Right.
that has a relationship kind of resonance. If you ever think about going with somebody else, I'll beat you to within an inch of your life, or I will kill you. If you read Deuteronomy 29, where all those threats are, it's pretty gruesome.
Right.
And God, in fact, says, if you disobey me, I will, just like I used to take delight in you, I will take delight in, sorry, just as I used to take delight in giving you benefits, I will take delight hurting you, basically,
Right.
taking them away from you.
Wow. Yeah. So very powerful, right? So I think what's interesting to me, as someone who's, approaching your work as a new reader, is just the variety of approaches that can be taken, right, with these texts.
Yeah. They're, you're right.
Yeah.
What can I say?
Yeah.
Another is, so in the song, the turning point is after the Israelites have received the benefits from God, the productive lands, and have eaten, something goes wrong right then. They are satisfied, they become, well, the word satisfied doesn't appear in the song. That appears elsewhere in Deuteronomy. But after they've eaten, the Israelites become fat, they become stupid, and they become wayward. They become errant, and worship other gods or give credit to other gods for the benefits. And Deuteronomy takes that up, and that moment of being satisfied with the food that you've just eaten, or having eaten too much a little bit, that's the turning point that leads to corruption. And for one thing, that fits into the abuse paradigm. Like, you can't enjoy anything because it will screw things up if you have any pleasure. But also it feeds into this idea that we still have. I mean, I don't know about the origins of all of this, but we have this idea that being fat is a moral problem. Like, you wouldn't be fat if you didn't enjoy food so much, if you controlled your eating, we've added like the idea of exercise to that, you know, if you weren't lazy. So that's just very interesting to me, the way this kind of blame is portrayed, and the way certain moral attributes are given to physical attributes.
Right. And so, and just, oh, please, Sarah, go.
Yes, this is Sarah from Scotland. One of the things I was noticing about the language used, and I don't know, you know, if that's just in this particular translation, but it had a resonance for me with some of the kinds of language we've seen in some of the Greek texts as well, that this this sort of moral uprightness and justice was described in terms of being upright, and that having some sort of injustice or wayward behavior was described as crooked. We've got similar kind of terminology in Greek texts. Is that something that you've noticed?
Yeah, definitely. This reversal of straightness into crookedness is definitely operative also in the Bible, and particularly in this song. There's also the idea of plants, whether they become fruitful plants or whether they become poisonous plants in this case, and what kind of plant is the Israelites, and why have they gone wrong? If God really is their parent plant, so to speak, why are they becoming poisonous? And you know, God himself kind of wrestles with that problem. He says in the beginning, you're not children of mine. You're full of problems. But there's also this, God wants to be their parent. So it's a conflict. Yeah. Thanks for that observation.
Well, Keith, you know, I see the time, it's 11:59, so we need to sign off. It seems like we've really just scratched the surface of these, I guess it's what, 40 or 45 lines, right?
Yeah. 43.
So hopefully you can come join us again. We could think about this text and some other texts maybe from the Hebrew Bible. I think it's really helpful for our community to consider different approaches to these works, and also to look for connections across the ancient Mediterranean, right?
I think that's right. I mean, there's a kind of Mediterranean koine, which is an operation, and the Israelites and their related cultures were part of that. Yeah, I'd be happy to take suggestions. If there are other biblical texts you'd like to explore, just let me know.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Keith. It was a pleasure having you today. I want to thank all our participants for joining us and the people who are watching online, either now or after the event. We appreciate your watching. And so,
one more thing.
Please.
In the future, which is a nice kind of parallel to Deuteronomy's point of view about present and future and how it the past. But today is Groundhog Day, and that movie, the movie Groundhog Day, is all about repetition and coming to a certain kind of enlightenment as you progressively repeat the same thing over and over again, which is kind of what the Song of Moses is about. So,
right. So by repeating the song over and over again, you mean?
Yeah, I thought it was very appropriate that today was the day.
Oh, perfect. Okay, well, thank you. That's a great connection. So Keith, thanks for joining us today on Groundhog Day of 2017. And so we will pick up our conversation again, I think in 2 weeks with our next open house discussion. And we hope you'll all join us. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.